Hi, this is Cale Schoenberg from the Sewing Machine newsletter on Substack. I have an upcoming lecture that I'm giving on sewing machines to between 50 and 100 people tomorrow, and I thought while I'm practicing for my lecture on how sewing machines make a stitch, I would record a video of that lecture so I can get it on YouTube, spread the word more widely, and give you guys some good sewing machine content that ought to be evergreen for years to come. So my goal for this lesson is relatively simple. It's to help people deepen their understanding of how a sewing machine works by explaining the function of the critical components on a sewing machine and how they interconnect with each other in order to make a stitch. My belief is that if you can attain a basic grasp of sewing machine mechanics, then that will pay dividends down the road when you eventually run into a problem with your machine. My logic is because you understand how the machine works, you will have a better chance of solving the problem when the problem arises, and problems will arise because sewing machines are pretty darn complicated. A little bit about my background before we dive in. Like I said, my name's Cale Schoenberg. I'm fourth generation in the sewing machine industry. Stepik Schoenberg, my great-grandfather, ran a factory in Argentina that manufactured parts for Husqvarna Viking. This would have been in the 1930s about. His son, my grandfather, Ramon Schoenberg, was born in Argentina, was educated in Switzerland as a mechanical engineer, then moved back to Argentina and went on to take over that factory and take over its daily operation. He eventually ran a factory in Buenos Aires where he manufactured home sewing machine called Maddox. In 1963, Ramon moved to Berkeley, California with his wife and 5 kids. In the Bay Area, Ramon would fix sewing machines 2 days a week as a part-time side hustle, make a little bit of extra money. He taught his oldest son, my uncle Marty, how to fix machines when Marty was really young. Marty has some good stories where he says how Ramon would bring him to the repair shop with him and would sit Marty down on the floor of the repair shop, give him an old machine, give him a Phillips head screwdriver and a flathead screwdriver, and he'd instruct Marty to disassemble the machine as best as he can. Take this machine and turn it into as many little parts as possible, and that was the beginning of Marty's training. As he got older, he became an extremely talented sewing machine repairman, and he went on to open his own business in traveling sewing machine repair out of his van. In the late 1980s, after Marty had been fixing machines out of his van for a few years, he recruited my dad, Dan. Dan is the baby in the family in this picture right here. That's my dad. That's Marty on the bottom right, Ramon on the top right. He recruited my dad, who was a natural salesperson, not a very talented salesman. He was actually selling Kawasaki motorcycles in Richmond, California, if you're familiar with the area. And he recruited my dad. My dad and Marty opened up the sewing machine shop in El Sobrante, California, and their business model was pretty simple at first. Marty fixed machines and my dad sold machines. Here's some good pictures of my dad on the left, Marty on the right. Here's Marty on the right, my dad on the left. My dad eventually learned how to fix sewing machines out of necessity because Marty took a step back from the business, started working part-time. And my dad took over. Fast forward many years down the road, around 2010, I was 16 years old in high school. I start servicing machines for my dad at the sewing machine shop, which now had moved to Walnut Creek by that time. I started fixing machines, my dad at first taught me how to fix or service, is a more accurate way to describe it. He taught me how to service this older FOF platform that he sold a bunch of in the 90s and early 2000s. So he would get those FOFs in all the time for service. He taught me how to service those, had this checklist of 20-something things that I would comb through. I'd get stuck on a harder issue, I'd go to my dad. At the end of the day, he'd slip me a 20 for each FOF I fixed, which, depending on the problems, took me between an hour and 3 hours. Fast forward again, I worked on and off for my dad after school and high school. Over the summer between colleges, I'd come home to visit my parents, stay with my parents, and I'd stay for the summer and fix sewing machines for my dad. Then in 2020, after the onset of COVID, the world changed, and I moved back home, started working full-time for my dad, started out in repair, but eventually moved to the sales floor, and I just learned so much working on the sales floor, encountering customers, sewists, seeing their actual problems with their machines, seeing, from my perspective, a hunger to genuinely learn more about how their machine works. Lots of misunderstandings and myths about sewing machines out there, and I really feel that I learned so much and absorbed sewing machines into my DNA. I think about them all the time now, and I am in a unique position, I think, to teach other people how they work, given my background. So, on to the lesson. After all that preamble might be unnecessary. My lecture is called How a Sewing Machine Makes a Stitch, or a sewing machine is a knot tying robot, which in many ways, that is what a sewing machine is. It is a little robot that ties knots for us in our fabric, stitches our fabric together. So I want to start out by defining the function of a sewing machine. A sewing machine's function is to bind multiple pieces of fabric together using thread. It achieves this by making a stitch. Humans have been hand stitching, hand sewing for thousands and thousands of years, and a sewing machine is essentially, what a sewing machine has done is essentially automate that hand stitching process in a way that is truly brilliant from an engineering perspective. It's an amazing invention. A very broad view of what a sewing machine does is it pokes a hole through our fabric with a needle. It then forms a knot between the needle thread and the bobbin thread. It cinches that knot that it just formed between the bobbin thread and needle thread. It cinches that knot up into the fabric, tightens it so that that knot locks together. All home sewing machines, as we think of sewing machines, are lock stitch machines. A sewing machine then, after cinching that knot into the fabric, feeds the fabric forward, then feeds the fabric forward, makes the next stitch. I want to go deeper than that kind of broad view I just articulated. How does a sewing machine actually work? Let's go one layer deeper. And if you go one layer deeper, you really are looking at a machine that consists of the upper shaft and the lower shaft. So when you break it down, a sewing machine is the upper shaft and lower shaft. All the machine's critical components are attached to either the upper shaft or lower shaft. So when you from your perspective as a sewer, you put your foot on the foot pedal, the motor runs, the motor's attached to a motor belt, so there's a belt coming off the motor that connects the motor to the upper shaft and the lower shaft. So you put your foot on the foot pedal, motor turns over, the upper shaft begins to turn, and the lower shaft begins to turn. And I got some good images here of a sewing machine without the covers on. This is a Janome mechanical machine. Costs about $200. Really well built, super simple. But you can see the upper shaft up here, lower shaft down here. Here's the motor. When you put your foot on the foot pedal, the motor runs, the upper shaft turns, the lower shaft turns, and the components that are attached to the upper and lower shaft begin to do their thing and contribute to the stitch making process. Another good image that I got from one of our techs, the tension assembly has been removed for some reason, I'm not quite sure, but as you can see, that upper shaft is really exposed there. Just thought that was a good image to share. Lower shaft you can see down here as well. There's the lower shaft. And one more image. This is just the lower shaft of a sewing machine. It's been basically cut off the sewing machine. The motor would have been right about here where my cursor is, highlighted in yellow. And then here you see that lower shaft, which would connect to the hook mechanism right here. So some sewing machine guts for us to look at. We're going to start with the upper shaft. So the upper shaft. There are two key components attached to the upper shaft. One is the needle bar, which holds the needle, super critical, obviously, to the stitch making process. The other one that's not so obvious but equally critical is the take-up lever. So you have the needle bar and you have the take-up lever attached to the end of the upper shaft. When the upper shaft turns, these two components basically move up and down. So let's start with the needle bar. The function of the needle bar is fairly intuitive, which is the needle bar moves the needle down to penetrate the fabric, and then it moves the needle up out of the fabric so the fabric can be fed forward. And it does this over and over again. The upper shaft turns, the needle bar goes down and up, down and up, down and up, over and over again. Pretty simple on the surface, right? Next slide. The other critical component attached to the upper shaft is the take-up lever. And this little piece right here, which I have images of on the far left, a Bernina take-up lever, and then these two on the right are, I believe they're Janome, but they could be a Baby Lock sewing machine too. Either way, every sewing machine in the world has a take-up lever, and when you thread your sewing machine, you thread the thread through the take-up lever eyelet prior to threading the needle. And it's a critical component, and I can't stress this enough. You need to thread your take-up lever and make sure that your thread is through that take-up lever eyelet, because the function of the take-up lever is that it takes the knot that's formed between the needle thread and bobbin thread. That knot forms below the needle plate, which we'll talk about later. That knot is formed below the needle plate, and it would forever stay below the needle plate as this loose knot if it weren't for the take-up lever. Because as a sewing machine runs and the upper shaft turns, the take-up lever goes down and then it swings back up. Goes down kind of slowly, pauses, and really swings back up. And the reason it swings back up like that is because it is cinching that loose knot below the needle plate up into the fabric. This site might look familiar to some of you. On the left here, we have a bunch of loose thread loops on the underside of our fabric. And this is caused by one thing and one thing only. When it's this bad, when it's this kind of bird's nest on the underside of your fabric. If you ever thread your machine and you accidentally miss the take-up lever, if you don't thread your thread through the take-up lever eyelet, that loose knot that forms between the needle and the bobbin thread below the needle plate that loose knot will not get cinched up into the fabric, and you'll get these large loops on the underside of your fabric. Some people call them a bird's nest. If you ever get this mess of large loops, it is because you missed your take-up lever. Small loops, eyelashes, some people call them, that's a different story. I'll talk about that in another video. Large bird nest loops like this in this image, you missed your take-up lever. I guarantee it. Just rethread your machine. Unthread it, rethread it. Make sure you thread that take-up lever eyelet, and that will solve the problem. Here's a great video animation made by Gross Beckert, which is a needle company, industrial needle company, German, and it's a great video of the stitch making process. I'm only going to watch it here for about a minute because it'll show us everything I want to talk about. So you're seeing the needle penetrate the fabric, and the stitch is getting made between the needle thread, which is green in this video, and the bobbin thread, which is yellow. Around 40 seconds, so in about 10 seconds, you're going to see the screen split in two. Right about now. And it's going to go in slow motion. You can see on the right side of the video, as the take-up lever swings up, the stitch goes from down below the needle plate and it gets cinched up into the fabric. So right now the needle's going down, take-up lever is also going down, needle penetrates the fabric, the hook catches that needle thread, takes it for a ride around the bobbin case, take-up lever is still down here, but as that loose knot forms and comes off the hook, take-up lever swings up, cinches our knot up into the fabric, and that's how a stitch gets made. The take-up lever is absolutely critical. It's just as critical as the hook, the needle, the thread, the fabric. Can't stress it enough. The take-up lever, please, if you can take one thing away from this lesson, learn that it's critical to visually confirm that your take-up lever is threaded before you start sewing. Okay, moving on. Before we go to the lower shaft, just a quick review of the upper shaft. What have we talked about so far? As the upper shaft turns, the needle bar moves up and down, over and over and over again. And as the needle moves up and down, so does the take-up lever. It goes down and it swings upward, down, swings upward, over and over again. The needle penetrates the fabric, and then the needle thread forms a loose knot below that needle plate in the vicinity of the bobbin and bobbin case area. And as the needle rises up out of the fabric and reaches its highest position, the take-up lever swings up vertically, cinches that knot from below the needle plate up into our fabric, and then the fabric gets fed forward and the whole process starts again. So, on to the lower shaft. So there are two critical mechanisms attached to the lower shaft, not counting the motor and some other stuff, but two critical stitch making components. That would be the hook mechanism and the feed mechanism. Got some good pictures here of a dressed down machine. You can see highlighted in blue, here's that lower shaft. At the end of the lower shaft, you have your hook circled in green, and then in red, you have your feed dogs, which are also attached to the lower shaft. Got another good picture here of a vertical rotary hook machine. This is actually one of those FOFs I was talking about earlier that I learned on. And you can see I have an arrow pointing to the hook point right here. The hook turns and turns and turns and turns, rotates over and over again. And here are our feed teeth poking up out of our needle plate. And we'll talk about what they do in just a minute. Okay, so the hook mechanism. What is the hook mechanism? It is a mechanism attached to the end of the lower shaft, and when you put your foot on the foot pedal, then the motor runs, the lower shaft turns, and the hook rotates over and over again. Some certain machines that have an oscillating hook, like some vintage Berninas, they'll oscillate, kind of rock back and forth. The hook will rock back and forth. But most machines, whether it's a Janome Baby Lock Brother, like a top-loading bobbin machine, which the hook rotates around and round counterclockwise, or it's a vertical rotary hook machine like a Janome HD9, Juki TL2010, Bernina with a B9 hook system. Those are all vertical rotary hook machines. And the hook rotates, it should be said, around the bobbin case, which I'm going to show you in this next slide. So here's the hook going on the outside, and the hook rotates around the bobbin and bobbin case. This is the same for every machine in the world that I know of. The hook rotates around the bobbin case. So, next slide. Let's talk about needle hook timing, because I think it'll help us understand the sewing machine a little bit better. The rotation of the hook and the movement of the needle are timed with one another, which if you zoom out, that means the upper shaft and the lower shaft are timed together. They're moving in unison. What's evidence of this timing between the hook and the needle movement? Well, as the hook is rotating around the bobbin case and the needle's moving up and down, the hook is set in the factory or by a sewing machine technician. The hook is set to pass behind the needle precisely above the needle eye. Every time the hook passes the needle, it passes above the needle eye. And it passes above the needle eye after the needle has gone to its bottommost position and risen about 2 to 3 millimeters above that bottommost position, which some sewing machine techs call bottom dead center. So the needle goes down, up, right? Well, when it goes down, it reaches its bottommost position, and as it begins to rise, just 2 to 3 millimeters above its bottommost position, the hook will pass behind the needle, and it'll pass just above the eye of the needle. Why is it passing just above the eye of the needle as the needle rises? Because that is when the thread loop, the needle thread, forms a loop at the eye of the needle. So the hook is timed to pass just above the eye of the needle, because as that loop forms, the hook passes through it and catches that loop. Absolutely critical to the stitch making process. I got some good images here taken from that video animation I showed you earlier, and you can see there's our hook right there. That's our hook point, and a loop has formed. Here's our needle, right? This is our needle. This is our hook point. The green thread is the loop that is formed right behind the eye of the needle. The hook is passing right above the eye of the needle, and it's catching that thread loop, and it's taking it for a ride around the bobbin case and making a stitch. Here's an image that took me a long time to get. I took this photo, kind of proud of it, because you can see the hook is catching the thread loop. It is passing right above the needle eye, catching that thread loop. That is needle hook timing. That is how the upper shaft and the lower shaft are interconnected in a very critical way. Moving on. After the hook catches that thread loop thrown by the needle, the hook continues its rotation. It continues its revolution around the bobbin and the bobbin case, right? So the hook catches that thread loop, and it takes that needle thread along with it for a ride around the bobbin case. And as it takes that needle thread for a ride around the bobbin case, that needle thread will form a loop around the bobbin thread, which is just kind of sitting out there waiting to be lassoed. And as the hook rotates around the bobbin thread and takes that needle thread with it, that needle thread lassos around the bobbin thread and forms a loose knot with that bobbin thread. And that loose knot is what will ultimately become our stitch. It forms a loose knot in that bobbin case area, and then that take-up lever cinches it upwards. Our tension discs do some work to also set the knot in our fabric. The fabric being fed forward helps set the knot in our fabric. There's a lot of intricacies at play that we could talk about later on, but for now, all you need to know is what I just said. And needle hook timing. Where am I right now? I'm lost. Okay, I know where I am. I'm at the part where I talk about skip stitches. So, perfect time to talk about skip stitches. I just talked about needle hook timing. Here's some good images of skip stitches. You can see on top, got some skip stitches on that top row right there. No skip stitches on that bottom row right there. Skip stitch zigzag, skip stitch on a decorative stitch. Excuse me. Skip stitches occur for one reason only, really, which is the hook point fails to catch the needle thread loop. If the hook misses that loop, a skip stitch will happen every time. A stitch cannot form if the hook misses that thread loop. And here's another video animation. This one's a little different because it's going to show a skip stitch. And you can see right here, the hook is catching the loop thrown at the eye of the needle. And right there, it didn't form. The loop didn't form. Skip stitch occurred. I'm going to go back. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little further. A little further. So right here, hook's passing behind the eye of the needle, but it doesn't catch that thread loop, and a stitch will not form. Sad, but it happens, and it happens for a variety of reasons. There are many things that cause skip stitches. One could be that the needle hook timing is off, which I just talked about needle hook timing, right? The hook has to pass above the eye of the needle, like in this picture right here, just as the needle rises 2 to 3 millimeters above its bottommost position. And if the needle hook timing's off, that means the hook is either arriving too early at the needle and it's passing way too high above the eye of the needle, or it's arriving too late at the needle and the loop's formed and the eye's gone and it's passing below the eye of the needle, and it misses that loop for those two reasons. That means the needle hook timing's off, and you can visually see it if you if you look at your machine, you take out the bobbin case, needle plate, and you just go slowly with the hand wheel, turning the hand wheel towards you, and you're looking at the needle go down to reach its bottommost position. As the needle rises and the hook passes behind the needle, where is the hook point in relation to the needle eye? Is it barely above the needle eye? Because that's a good thing. That means your needle hook timing is looking good and the skip stitch is being caused by something else. But if it's passing below the eye of the needle, hook timing's off. Needle hook timing's off, guaranteed. If it's passing too high above the eye of the needle, it might be a little more difficult to see with the untrained eye, but that can also mean the needle hook timing is off and needs to be adjusted. Now, just a brief insight to what our technicians do to fix needle hook timing, and this is difficult for you to do at home. I would not recommend it. A trained technician can do it, but at home it's going to be hard. So what a technician does is he actually disconnects the upper shaft and lower shaft from each other, because when the motor turns, it's turning the upper shaft and lower shaft. When you turn the hand wheel towards yourself, you're going to move both the upper shaft and lower shaft at the same time. But if the needle hook timing's off, you need to pause one of those shafts, freeze it in time, and manually turn the other shaft so that they're working harmoniously with each other, so that they're timed up properly and the hook's passing right above the needle eye, and then you reconnect those shafts so they're moving together again. So our techs will basically disconnect the shafts, usually like the upper shaft. He'll turn the hand wheel so that the needle reaches its bottommost position and just begins to rise 2 to 3 millimeters. And then when he has the needle in the right position, he'll disconnect the upper shaft and lower shaft, and he'll manually turn the lower shaft so that the hook is passing just above the eye of the needle. And then he'll pause there, he'll reconnect the upper shaft and lower shaft, and you should be good to go. The machine should be back in time after that. Now, with all that said, that is not the most common reason you get skip stitches. From my experience, a far more common reason is that a critical setting called needle hook clearance is off. So, when the hook passes behind the needle, it needs to pass very close in distance to the needle. So close that it's not quite touching, but close to touching. You should, my dad explained it to me when he was teaching it to me, you should just see a little bit of daylight between the hook and the needle as the hook passes behind the needle. Close but not touching. If you just tap the needle with your finger, you should see it flex and touch the needle, touch the hook rather, but it should not be touching as it passes behind. And in this picture here, you can see on the left side, this is good needle hook clearance. You can see a little bit of daylight if you zoom in there between the hook and the needle, right there. There's a little bit of daylight between the two. On the right, there's not. The hook is touching the needle. There's no daylight between the two. That's a problem. That's going to cause skip stitches a lot of the time. And you can imagine the inverse being true as well. If there's too much distance between the hook and the needle as the hook passes behind the needle, if there's too much distance, it'll just miss the hook. It'll be too far away from the loop to catch the loop. The hook will be too far away from the loop to catch the loop. That can cause skip stitches as well, and needle hook clearance being off, from my experience, like I said, a much more common cause of skip stitches. However, an even more common cause of skip stitches, let me look at my notes real quick. An even more common cause of skip stitches that I really want to stress here is bent needles, because from my experience, bent needles are the #1 cause for skip stitches. The amount of times someone's come into the shop and told me that their needle's bent, or come into the shop and complained of skip stitches, and I troubleshoot the machine in front of them, and all I do, it's just my habit now, is to insert a fresh needle before I sew on a machine. I need to know that the needle's straight and brand new out of the box. So the first thing I do is I insert a new needle and I sew. No skip stitches. The sewer who brought it in is aghast, and oh my God, it was happening every time at home. What did you do? It's not a magic trick. I simply inserted a fresh needle. Why? Why does a bent needle cause skip stitches? Because a bent needle will simulate poor needle hook clearance. If it's bent forward a little bit or backwards a little bit, it'll simulate needle hook clearance being off, and skip stitches will occur for the same reasons I just described for why skip stitches occur during why skip stitches will occur with poor needle hook clearance. So, a key takeaway if you're watching this is if you ever experience skip stitches, the first thing to do is change your needle, put in a new one that's fresh out of the box. It's a variable you have to, it's just a variable, it's the first variable you need to account for when troubleshooting your machine with skip stitches, and quite frankly with any stitch quality issue. I highly recommend you change your needle before, as the first thing you do before, change your needle as the first thing you do as you troubleshoot your machine. So, moving on, slide number 32 here. I just talked about the hook mechanism, one of the key components on the lower shaft. Now I'm going to talk about the feeding mechanism, which you might be more familiar with as those gripped feed teeth you see underneath your needle plate, which some of us refer to as feed dogs. The function of the feed mechanism is fairly straightforward, which is after the knot has been cinched up into the fabric by the take-up lever, the feed dogs will feed the fabric forward in preparation for the next stitch to be made. The feed mechanism is also timed with the needle. So once the needle pierces the fabric, the feed dogs will lower beneath the needle plate and will not touch the fabric. They will not feed the fabric, because you don't want your fabric being fed while the needle's in the fabric. That'll bend the needle, right? So the feed dogs rise above the needle plate only after the needle has exited the fabric and is reaching its highest position. Then the feed dogs will come up, lift your fabric up, feed your fabric forward, and as the needle goes down, the feed dogs will dip below the needle plate, out of sight, out of play, and the stitch will get made. Then they'll come back up after the needle comes up, feed it forward again. They'll feed the fabric forward however many millimeters you have your stitch length set to. So if you have your stitch length set to 2 millimeters, which is pretty standard, it'll feed the fabric forward 2 millimeters. It'll feed it 3 millimeters if you have your stitch length set to 3, etc., etc. So, feed timing is important to understand for a few different reasons. Like I said earlier, you wouldn't want your fabric being fed while your needle is down in the fabric, because if the fabric's being fed with the needle in the fabric, it'll bend the needle, and that can cause all sorts of issues. It results in needle strikes on the needle plate, like specifically around the needle plate hole. A lot of needle strikes will form. It'll result in burrs on that needle plate that can cause thread snags and thread breakage. Burrs on the bobbin case, on the hook mechanism itself, which causes all sorts of problems. And in extreme cases, it can cause broken needles as well. So that timing between the upper shaft and lower shaft, between the movement of the needle and the movement of your feeding mechanism, super important, a critical setting, and it can cause all sorts of issues if it's out of whack. And it does get out of whack from time to time, and it's not that important for the user to know, but it's helpful, and it's most helpful in my opinion because just like a bent needle can simulate poor needle hook clearance. Um, Us, the sewist, we can imitate poor feed timing, which can lead to all those problems I just described. Broken needles, burrs on the needle plate, burrs on the bobbin case. It's actually really common that we do something that simulates poor feed timing. So the two things from my experience that I've seen where the sewer is simulating poor feed timing and leading to all these needle strikes and burrs and potentials for thread breakage, thread snags, poor stitch quality is one is free motion sewing, because in free motion sewing the feed dogs are down and we're controlling the movement of the fabric, and we accidentally move the fabric while the needle is down in the fabric. That's one cause, and with quilters we see this quite a bit. If you have a stitch regulator, that gets rid of the problem for reasons I'm happy to talk about later, maybe in the Q&A session that I'll have after the lecture. This is just practice right now, but perhaps someone will ask me about that and I can go into why stitch regulators solve that problem. Another reason is if we're sewing super heavy fabric. So if you've ever sewed super heavy fabric and you feel like your machine is struggling to feed the fabric forward, we might feel compelled to push the fabric forward and help the machine feed the fabric. And a lot of times it works, and your machine can sew through something that's pretty darn thick. However, as we push the fabric forward, we might push it forward while the needle's still in the fabric. And if we push it forward while the needle's still in the fabric, what's going to happen? The needle's going to bend. It's going to sort of, instead of going straight up and down through the needle plate hole, which is pretty narrow, it'll deflect. Let me see, I think I have a picture in this next slide. Yeah. See this needle plate hole? Pretty small. So if we push the fabric forward, the needle bends. It'll strike that needle plate hole. It can really chew it up. As you can see in this picture on the left here, I took this picture because it was one of the most chewed up needle plates I'd seen in a long time. That'll cause your thread to break. It'll cause strange stitch quality. Sometimes it leads to small loops, that kind of thing. It can lead to some gnarly burrs. So this one's much more difficult to see on the right, but you can see a needle strike on that needle plate hole left this jagged burr out of the metal, and that caused stitch quality issues for this specific customer. So what's the lesson here? Okay, here's some more good pictures actually of a bobbin case that got needle strikes on it, and this might not necessarily be from pushing fabric forward. This could have been caused by something else, but the larger point is it can cause needle strikes on the bobbin case and the hook mechanism and the needle plate. And I guess the larger lesson here is, like, if you're sewing heavy fabric, don't force it. If you're doing free motion sewing, I guess maybe the lesson is just to be aware that it can happen. And if you're experiencing stitch quality issues and you want to self-diagnose from home, analyze your needle plate hole, analyze your bobbin case. If you see needle strikes like this, in this case the bobbin from the backside, you can see it's just missing a chunk of plastic. But if you see burrs, if you see strikes on the bobbin case, that's a good indication of your problem. So that's the lesson to be taken away. Maybe the lesson is if this keeps happening to you and you do a lot of heavy sewing, you need a heavier duty machine, like one of the, they sell these sweet straight stitch semi-industrial machines that are fairly cost effective, portable too. Maybe that's the solution if you're sewing heavier stuff. And if you're sewing quilts and free motion, you're getting a lot of issues like that, maybe you invest in a machine that has a stitch regulator at some point. So, moving on, that is the conclusion of the lesson. That's way too big. That's the conclusion of my lesson for today. Just to review real quick, we talked about the upper shaft and its two key components, which is the needle bar and the take-up lever. We talked about the lower shaft and its two key components, which is the hook mechanism and the feed mechanism. And we talked about how all these parts work in unison to create a stitch. There are other critical parts of a sewing machine that I didn't cover in as much detail today, but that I would like to cover in the future if these lectures become popular and I get good feedback on them. So like in 2 weeks from now, actually 4 weeks from now, I believe 4 weeks from now, I'm going to have a lecture on needles and do a deep dive into needles and why you want to pick a certain needle size, certain needle type, how to pair your needle with your thread. I will be talking about thread in the future, but these are just critical parts of the machine I wasn't able to cover today. Tension discs, obviously super important and something that you can troubleshoot from home. And bad tension is so common that we'll need to cover it. Bobbin winding, underrated, critical thing that you can do right or you can do wrong when setting up your machine to sew. Check spring, I put that on this list here, and we could talk about that if you'd like, but probably not that important to cover unless we really go down the rabbit hole. Needle threader, I love talking about needle threaders. I have strong opinions on needle threaders, why they break, what you can do to save your needle threader at home. Needle plate, presser foot, all super important. Wasn't able to cover them in detail today, but hopefully if this lecture series goes on and grows and picks up steam, we can eventually check these off the list, and it's like going to Sewing Machine University, right? So, yeah. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you watching this far. This is nearly 50 minutes. So, thank you so much. I hope you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, leave your questions in the comments. If you're watching this on my Substack, leave your questions in the comments of the Substack article, and I'll try to get to them at some point. I have a lot of articles written already on some of this. Like, this whole lecture series is kind of being built off my Substack. I've written like 150 articles on sewing machines so far, and I just have a lot of material to go through and a lot of stuff that I think I can teach people. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.